It is October 1st, 2021. It is the first day of the new budget season. And I've had a lot of people reach out, have questions specifically in regard to vaccine mandate language that was in the budget, vaccine passport language that was in the budget, and probably the most hot button issue is the mask language that was in the budget. Budget bills are a little bit different than normal policy bills. The stuff that we learn about in high school civics class, budget bills have a little bit more quirky. There's a little bit more nuance to them. I'd like to explain it because there's been a lot of confusion, specifically when it comes to something being unenforceable or enforceable as deemed by the governor. What does that even mean? Does that have any type of legal bearing? So that's something I really want to get into. And let's start with going into the vaccine language that we had in the budget. So what we have here is the language in the budget in regard to vaccine mandates and vaccine passports. I'm not going to read the whole text. There's a lot here. I think it's kind of illustrative of how much work that went into it to reach an agreement here with the administration. Essentially, it pretty clearly says that we can't create a vaccine passport here in the state. It also says, if you look at subsection C here in part one, it says we can't basically hand over our database to some outside organization to have a third party create a vaccine database that can be used. So I'm really glad to see that. Why is this important? Well, you don't have to look very much farther than just Canada across the border, seeing what they're doing there. You have to prove your vaccine to go to restaurants, other public places. So it's definitely something of concern, and I'm glad we have this in the budget. The other thing we have here is for state employees and for local government employees. There's language in here that says that as a condition of employment, an employee cannot be forced to prove that they have had the vaccine. This is something we're seeing from throughout the country. There are many people that work for the government, especially in my district. We have the prison system. We have many local governments. A lot of people are employed by those. So just making sure that we're not forcing mandates on these people. So again, this is nothing against the vaccine. This policy is just about the government not dictating this type of decision for an individual. We're going to go on to language that dealt with vaccines, but this was in regard to universities. We had an incident where the governor's press secretary made some statements the night before the budget was signed or the day before the budgets were signed. They weren't illustrative of what the agreement was we had with our budget agreement. I was very appreciative that the governor came out the next day and clarified what the agreement was and what the stance was of the administration. This language is deemed enforceable. So this is basically says that if any student wants an exemption, they have to be given it. And then there's pretty specific language in here. It says for anybody who's not going to be giving it, there needs to be clear and convincing evidence as to why they shouldn't. And they need to be given a written report saying what the reasonable accommodations were that the university gave. I've heard of incidents where universities were requiring students that were only taking remote classes to prove that they have a vaccine. That definitely would not be a reasonable accommodation. So I think this is very effective language, and I think it's going to be impactful on some of those outliers. I think this addresses a lot of problems that we have right now with the universities, some of them just going too far. And that's not all of them. We have a lot of universities that aren't requiring a mandate or that are giving reasonable accommodations. So the governor said in her statements she didn't think this would apply to a lot of universities because they're already in compliance. So I really think there's just a few universities that are going to have to adjust their policies. So I'm glad to see that this language made it in here. There is an issue of the governor did say it was her belief that universities have constitutional autonomy, which is true. Universities do have constitutional autonomy, but that autonomy is not limitless. And the legislature has the power of the purse, and we are allowed to put conditions on funding. We don't just fork over a bunch of money to universities without any type of metrics or rules that go with that. We have performance funding. We have lots of different ways that we use funding to try and drive outcomes at universities. So I definitely fully believe that this language has the full force of law. Now, lastly, here I'm going to talk about the mask language, the new mask language that we put in the budget this year. So I have highlighted the fourth section here that was added. The top three sections were in existing law for I don't know how long, I'm assuming quite a while. So what this section says is that if a local health officer has a local health epidemic order in place starting October 1st, that money can't go out unless the local board of commissioners passes a resolution supporting the epidemic order. Now, a couple of thoughts on this. First off, there's been some accusations that the legislature was withholding funding. Most definitely, this money is not being withheld. The intent here is to improve local control. Right now, we have one unelected bureaucrat in a county that can make a decision on masking children without any type of public input. This is about ensuring there's local accountability. This is a decision that hits close to home with many, many people, including myself. I have kids that are in school that are subject to a mask order. I very much believe that these are decisions that should be made by parents and that should be made at the local school board level, where local officials can be held accountable because they're elected and they're put there by the people. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about enforceability and non-enforceability. This is something that I really don't think a lot of people would have learned about in high school civics, probably not even in college government courses. So budget bills are a little bit different of an animal. I guess let's give an example of what it would mean for there to be language in a budget that's not enforceable. Let's say we have an example of in the transportation budget, somebody was to put in language that said the money can't be dispersed unless there are 80-mile-an-hour speed limits on all highways in the state of Michigan. That would be what's called an amendment by reference. There's a different public act that deals with what speed limits are throughout the state of Michigan, and you can't use a budget bill to amend a different act. You have to open up the act where that law is in place. So the governor said that this section 4 is unenforceable. I think she's deeming in her mind that it's an amendment by reference. I disagree with that wholeheartedly. And a good example as to why. First off, this is not saying the funding can't go out. The funding can go out. It's not being withheld. There's just an extra step that has to be fulfilled. The local board of commissioners would need to weigh in. We put conditions on most all. We have a $68 billion budget. I'd say almost every line item has some type of condition that goes with it. And if you look at, we've been hearing a lot of local health departments rescinding their health orders. I don't know exactly what their lawyers are telling them, but I'm going to suspect they're looking at subsection 3 here, because this is in another area where a condition on this funding that goes out to local health departments is put in place. So if you look at subsection 3, it says distributions in subsection 1 shall be made only to counties that maintain local spending at the current year of at least the amount expended in the fiscal year 1992-93 for the services described in subsection 1. So this is called a maintenance of effort provision. So for instance, let's say Kent County reduced the amount of money they put into their local health department. And they put it at their 1991 level, something that's below 1992. Well, the state would withhold their funding. That is a condition. That is a condition of withholding funding. It is something the legislature does all the time. So the governor has the ability to veto language that she doesn't see fit. The thing is, if that happens, the funding that's associated with it also gets vetoed. So I believe there's about $40 million that's associated with this line item. If that section was to be vetoed, the funding would have to go with it. So that's why, and this is not something that only Governor Whitmer has done. This is quite common. Governors have deemed certain language unenforceable in the past. Most people haven't heard about it because it's not usually something that hits so close to home. So there you have it. In the fiscal year 22 State of Michigan budget, this is a quick overview of the vaccine passport and mandate language, and also a quick overview of the mask language that was put in place. Uh, you know, people are going to ask, well, what's next? What happens when something is deemed unenforceable? Well, we have three separate equal branches of government. I work in the legislature. I only write laws. So this is what was written. The governor signed it into law. It's her job to enforce. She decided not to enforce this particular provision in regard to masks. So frankly, if there's ever a dispute of what the law is, those disputes get settled in the judicial branch. So I'm not aware of any legal disputes that come down to unenforceability. I think why you've seen a handful, I think there's 6 counties or so that have now rescinded their mask orders. I think it's because they don't want to find out. They don't want to get halfway through the year and lose funding. I saw Kent County and Ottawa County came out and they said that they thought that the language was an amendment by reference. I completely disagree. We simply put a condition on the funding, just like the other conditions of funding that are in that same section in the Public Health Code funding. So that's it for now. We're going to keep moving forward. I said earlier this year when I expressed my displeasure for the mask mandate in Kent County that I would use all the tools I had in place, including the power of the purse. I think we've delivered some results. We had Ione County, which is in my district, rescind their order, and we've seen others throughout the state. And I think we might see some more. So stay tuned, and God bless.